You touched on the rivalries, the warfare between different Celtic peoples, tribes, and I think what's quite a prevalent view in the modern day is that the history of the English is one of invasion and subjugation of the innocent peoples, the innocent Celtic peoples, Brittonic peoples of the British Isles. You've touched on the fact that some of these peoples were not exactly shrinking violets when it came to warfare. I think, yes, it's probably fair to say that England's managed to gain a level of military and technological supremacy through, from the conquest onwards, perhaps before that. But what would you say about the notion that it was a one-way street, that ultimately it was the English peoples always seeking to subjugate, or is it, as ever, more nuanced than that?
It's more nuanced, of course. It's always more nuanced. In history, you can always say to someone in response to anything they say, well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, and you'll always be correct. So it's like a bit of an annoying thing to say, because you can say at any given point. But the nuances go on and on, because reality is always nuanced. If you go to a party and give an account of it, there's no account that you could give that couldn't be more nuanced, because there's always so many little things that could have happened. But the fact is, yes, like sometimes... just to give an example, just to like sort of disrupt that narrative. Sometimes the pagan English were allied with Christian Celtic peoples against Christian English. So you know what I mean? Like a king of an Edwin of Northumbria is a king, a pagan, a Christian, and he was fighting against, I think it was Penda, who was allied with some Celtic Britons. And then later on, after the English are all Christian, the Vikings come, and then you think, oh, well, who are the pagan Vikings going to ally with? Well, sometimes they ally with Christian Celts against English people. It's not so much like Christian versus pagan or Celtic versus Germanic. It's more just like little kingdoms who are willing to make alliances with anyone if they can win against the enemy they happen to have at that given moment.
Okay, well, that's something that I think I was expecting you to say. It is something that I find frustrating. Not that I find it frustrating because I'm some jingoistic, Anglophile that suggests there are no skeletons in the closet of the English people. I also have some Scottish in me too, and so I have sympathy for all of the British peoples, really. But I always find it quite remarkable when I hear people suggest that there is almost nothing good, and that it's only ever been a one-way street, as though, for example, I think the Irish, because of the I suppose the Cromwellian absolute subjugation of them, which is going to really rankle them on the plantations for sure. But I think the notion that the Irish were just an innocent peoples is something that I've always found to be far-fetched, and this isn't trying to attach any kind of everlasting sin on a nation at all. But I think it's interesting that when you look into the genetics, and as you've alluded to, Anatolian peoples, people from modern-day Turkey, came to these isles, and I think Ireland, particularly all of the men, are descended from Anatolian folks who arrived and effectively put the Irish men out of business.
Well, I mean, in this respect, Ireland is in no way unique at all, but for having Anatolian ancestry. Everyone in Europe is between 75 and half of descended from the farmers of Neolithic Europe, who themselves have an Anatolian origin. But the actual replacement that came, I mean, all Irish people, like all British people and all Germanic and Celtic people in Northwest Europe, all have significant ancestry from the Indo-Europeans, and their paternal lineages all come from them, not from Anatolia. It's very rare that anyone in Northern Europe has their paternal lineages of Anatolian origin. They rather have Eastern European paternal lineages, and that's what Ireland is associated with now. This Eastern European, Indo-European steppe component of R1b or R1a haplogroups mainly. But the Irish are continued that warrior cult. The Irish, like the Germanic tribes and the Celtic tribes, all of them continued this warrior culture of the ancient Indo-Europeans, which was often focused on cattle herding and things like that. The Irish, being industrial, simultaneously, Irish are interesting because they're simultaneously one of these very early Christian peoples who adopted Christianity so early on in history, and in that sense you would see them as being more civilized and being one of the more advanced peoples of Europe. But also at the same time they had the Industrial Revolution so late, and they often depended on like pastoralist kind of economies, high amounts of dairy, risk of famine, very violent internecine conflicts, the clan-based systems, which are actually very old-fashioned sort of Bronze Age ways of living. So they're sort of, it's interesting that Ireland are both those things at the same time. It's hard to imagine why. I mean, the Normans used to say, I think some of the Normans said that the Irish had green skin. So even like as recently as that time in history, 1,000 years ago, the Irish still had this almost mythical quality. They're like, like green-skinned monster people or something. Like no one really knew what they were, and their belief that they lived entirely off milk and stuff like this. But those were probably exaggerations of the reality. But it just shows that like Ireland's quite an enigma in that sense. It's not easily defined. It is different from the rest of the British Isles, different from the rest of Europe. But they're not. We're a warrior race. So yes, they were oppressed by the English people, but Cromwell particularly, and they suffered badly under the potato famines. But they historically didn't view themselves as victims because they were colonizers. They invaded Scotland, the Scotti invaded, and they also did slave raids. They took like slaves from Cornwall, even in places like that, Wales and Cornwall. And it's believed Sir Patrick was made a slave in Ireland, so they were slavers and warriors and fighters, and still are. Some of them quite keen on fighting, I understand.